Now, yesterday, Vodacom and the Competition Commission announced that Vodacom would drop data prices by 30%. A 1 gigabyte data package will fall by 34%. But not everyone's happy with that. Public Interest SA and the SMME Forum say underserved black communities have been at the receiving end of extortionist data pricing. To discuss this, we're joined by Tebogo Khaas, a social activist with Public Interest South Africa. Thank you for being with us, Tebogo.
Thanks for having us.
So you say congratulating Vodacom for doing so little is tantamount to congratulating a shark for swimming slowly. Why does this impress you so little?
Well, we are underwhelmed by the announcement to start with.
Yeah, that's putting it lightly.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Because we believe that Vodacom could have done more. We know that the pricing, the consumers are on the receiving end of high data pricing, especially in South Africa. And what makes it even more so concerning is the fact that other countries where Vodacom is operating in Africa or elsewhere, they enjoy much more cheaper data pricing compared to us. And to think that Vodacom is a South African company which ought to be putting South Africa first and South Africans first does not seem to be responding positively to the kind of clamor or the noise or the demands for data pricing to make local businesses more competitive. I'm talking SMEs, as well to make access to the internet or access to ICTs much more affordable for depressed communities.
But 30% is significant. I mean, what were you hoping for?
Well, it's like Black Friday. If you say, I'll give you 50% discount on a pricing that has been artificially exorbitant, obviously you'll rejoice. But we know that the pricing ought not to be where it was to start with. Because even the 34% that they have announced on the retail, the headline pricing that they do, actually comes from a very huge margin that they've been, picking up in terms of the pricing. Yeah. And what is also saddening is that, as you would know, Vodacom is foreign owned by Vodafone. It means all the profits have been spirited out of the country, either as through transfer pricing or just dividends. And we're saying the local economy is suffering.
Is Vodacom not a very big employer in South Africa?
They are certainly a very big employer in South Africa, but where do the profits go? The profits go to the UK.
Okay, so how deep are the cuts to data that you want from Vodacom and presumably MTN as well? We're waiting for what they're going to do.
Okay, and before I address that, take note of the fact that Vodacom, how Vodacom was started. Vodacom picked up from Telkom. They actually stole Telkom's lunch. Telkom started Vodacom, if you recall, and using what Telkom infrastructure, which is government infrastructure. So the people of South Africa actually contributed to Vodacom formation. Yeah. Never mind MTN and Cell C and others. So for Vodacom to be so impervious of the plight of the poor and poorest, to actually be saying, look, we're doing 34% or 30%, whatever it is, we feel is a bit too rich for a company that ought to be alive to the fact that how it was started, it benefited from the toils, from the sweat of the South African taxpayers.
So how deep are the cuts that you want, that you believe Vodacom and MTN can afford?
We do not ask for anything less than, or we would expect anything less than what it's already happening in other jurisdictions where Vodacom is operating in Africa, where we believe data pricing are actually even cheaper. In fact, even if you benchmark Vodacom, even after 34% cut, they're still far more expensive than Telkom, 1 gig or even a 20 gig bundle. If you compare apples with apples. So we believe that they could have done more. And if you look at it, actually, Vodacom hides behind the spectrum availability to say if we had more spectrum released, we could do better. But we say no. You should actually be doing better now before the actually additional spectrum is made available to yourselves.
Well, that brings me to my next question. I was going to say, would it help? Vodacom and the big players have been saying spectrum. The release of spectrum in South Africa has been delayed for years and years and years, and that does affect them.
That's a red herring, quite honestly, and it's very disappointing to see Vodacom still holding on to that spectrum excuse, because if you know, most major or telcos in South Africa that's a regulated sector, and they had obligations licensing obligations going back to the early 90s, when there are certain minimum things in terms they ought to have been service they ought to be providing to underserviced areas, and they've all gone quiet in terms of how they're meeting up those. Never mind the Millennium Development Goals, but even those licensing conditions requirements that they need to fulfill. And we're saying they ought to actually come to the party and ensure that access to ICTs is not only limited to those in the leafy suburbs, but make sure that those in underprivileged areas or underserved areas need to also be brought on board.
Two final points. I mean, Vodacom has also said for years, and so has MTN, that they spend millions or billions on infrastructure. And they do need to recoup that investment and have money to continue to expand in South Africa. Is that an argument for one? And then what about, I understand this deal does allow for some free sites. Surely sites for small businesses could be free. Isn't there a possibility for a third way here?
There could be a possibility for that, and we're not ungrateful for the reduction. Let's make that point very clear. The reduction is welcome, but what we are saying is that more could still be done, and to the extent that Vodacom itself says, look, this is going to cost us 27 billion or 1.2 billion, whatever the amount is. We say, or 2.7 billion. We're saying, yes, so it might very well be. But how much profit have they really made on the back of the poor communities in South Africa? For us not to be reminded, oh, by the way, this is going to cost us 2.7 billion. And by the way, release more spectrum for us to be able to do more. And we think a lot more can be done. And one of the things that we're also agitating on, and we see a little bit of silence insofar as it's concerned, is it's about time that we consider a digital sovereign wealth option to ensure that all these telcos contribute to a fund that could make access to ICTs by those less privileged communities is made much more available.
That's an interesting idea. So not the miners contributing to the sovereign wealth fund, but telcos.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you for your time this evening. Not happy at all with 30%, saying it could go much, much further, especially for small businesses. Tebogo Khaas, social activist with Public Interest South Africa.